Welcome to Outside Views, where today we're diving into a fascinating and complex development in the ongoing Brexit narrative. The leaked EU document suggesting that a youth visa scheme is essential to reset Brexit relations. The document, which has been reported in media recently, highlights the EU's strong desire for a youth mobility scheme that would allow young people from the UK and the EU to live and work abroad more easily. The leak reveals a policy priority that Brussels sees as vital to repairing ties with Britain, despite ongoing resistance from Prime Minister Keir Starmer. To set the stage, this visa scheme would be aimed specifically at people under 30. If implemented, it would give young people a pathway to live in another country for a few years, provided they have the means to support themselves and obtain an affordable visa. It's a move that advocates believe that would help mitigate some of the loss of freedom of movement that Brexit imposed, especially for the younger generation that feels it was disproportionately impacted by Brexit. But the response from the UK government so far has been cautious, even dismissive. Prime Minister Keir Starmer has publicly stated that he has no plans for a youth mobility scheme with the EU. This stance comes despite a split within the Labour Party, with several MPs and mayors, including figures like Andy Burnham and Sadiq Khan, openly supporting such a scheme. And meanwhile, Home Secretary Yvette Cooper remains staunchly opposed, given the political sensitivity around immigration statistics in the UK. What's clear from the leaked document is that this isn't just a casual suggestion from the EU, it's a high priority item. The document calls the youth mobility scheme an indispensable element of future negotiations with London and describes it as essential for our future relationship. And this language indicates that Brussels is serious about the scheme, viewing it as a key factor in resetting Brexit relations. Let's talk a bit about the logic behind the EU's push for this youth visa scheme. For many EU leaders, Brexit felt like a setback, not just politically, but culturally and socially. It disrupted established ties and imposed new restrictions on movement that were previously unthinkable for a generation of young Europeans. The EU views youth mobility as a way to reopen some of those lost opportunities, allowing young people to experience other cultures and build connections across borders. Supporters argue that with countries like South Korea, Japan and Australia already part of the UK's reciprocal youth mobility arrangement, it seems logical for the UK to offer a similar opportunity to its closest neighbours in Europe. The idea is to reinstate a sense of cross-border exchange that Brexit took away, but under terms that are still manageable and politically feasible for the UK. But let's address the other side of the argument. Why is the UK government so reluctant to embrace this idea? For one, any policy that appears to reintroduce freedom of movement can be politically sensitive in the UK, especially post-Brexit. While a youth mobility scheme is not the same as full freedom of movement, there is concern that it could be seen as a step back towards it. And the government has made it clear that there will be no return to freedom of movement, a red line that they are unwilling to cross. A Downing Street spokesperson recently reinformed this, saying, "We're not going to be joining an EU-wide youth mobility scheme. There will be no return to freedom of movement, and that remains our position." However, there's more at play than just political messaging. Home Secretary Yvette Cooper's opposition to the scheme reflects a concern over the UK's immigration statistics, which remain a touchy subject. The government is wary of anything that could potentially increase immigration numbers, especially with public sentiment still sharply divided over post-Brexit migration policies. There's also a perception within the UK government that EU's push for youth mobility is part of a broader attempt to steer post-Brexit negotiations in its favour. Some UK officials see this as Brussels testing the waters, aiming to see if the UK will soften its stance on key Brexit outcomes. But here's where things get interesting. Despite the UK's firm stance, there is growing support for the youth mobility scheme within the Labour Party itself. Labour MP Ian Room from North Devon recently questioned Europe Minister Stephen Doughty about what countries like Iceland and Monaco can participate in the UK's youth mobility scheme, but not close neighbours like Ireland and France. And Stella Creasy, who chairs the Labour Movement for Europe, has also voiced support, stating that a youth mobility scheme is not the same as freedom of movement. And Creasy argues that with similar schemes already in place with countries like Uruguay, Japan and Canada, it's entirely feasible for the UK to extend the same option to EU nations without compromising immigration control. Doughty, who plays a role in overseeing relations with Europe, has taken a more measured approach. He reminded MPs that the government will not be providing a running commentary on discussions with the EU and reiterated the commitment to finding constructive ways to work together without reviving freedom of movement. And this careful language reflects the balancing act the UK government is trying to maintain, showing willingness to collaborate with the EU while sticking to its post-Brexit red lines. Will not work in the long run, but still. Now, what does this mean for the future of Brexit relations between the UK and the EU? The leaked document suggests that the EU is not planning to back down on its priorities. Brussels sees youth mobility as essential to forging a stronger future relationship, and they are willing to negotiate on the details to make it more palatable for the UK. There are already hints that the EU could propose certain compromises, like setting caps on the number of visas, applying tighter eligibility criteria, or allowing shorter stays. And these adjustments could help the UK government justify the scheme to its base while addressing some of the EU's demands. Another EU diplomat who spoke on condition of anonymity to press said that youth mobility was the number one demand raised by member state ambassadors ahead of Prime Minister Keir Starmer's recent visit to Brussels. And this underscores how just crucial the EU's views the scheme, seeing it as the foundation for resetting Brexit relations. Beyond youth mobility, the document gives insight into other aspects of the EU's approach to Brexit negotiations. For example, the EU has clarified that it has no intention of reopening the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the TCA, which forms the basis of the UK-EU trade relationship. According to the document, revisiting the TCA would not benefit either side, given that the UK's red lines on rejoining the single market, the customs union and freedom of movement remain unchanged. However, the EU is open to exploring agreements alongside the TCA, particularly in areas like defense, security and possibly veterinary standards. So, what would a youth mobility scheme look like if it were implemented? In theory, it would allow young people under 30 from both the UK and the EU to live in another country for a limited period, provided they meet certain criteria. This wouldn't be a free-for-all. Applicants would need to show that they have the financial means to support themselves and obtain an inexpensive visa. Caps and restrictions could also be applied to manage the number of people who use the scheme, making it a controlled form of mobility rather than an open-door policy. For the EU, the scheme is about much more than just allowing young people to travel. It represents a tangible step towards reconnecting the people of Europe and the UK, particularly the younger generation, who may feel disconnected from their European counterparts post-Brexit. It's also a way to foster cultural exchange, economic ties, and mutual understanding, which could help rebuild some of the relationships that have been, let's say, quite strained by Brexit. In summary, the EU's leaked document highlights an issue that is likely to remain a sticking point in UK-EU relations. While the UK government remains opposed to the scheme, there is a growing push from within the Labour Party and other supporters who see the value in creating a pathway for young people to experience life abroad. Whether this youth mobility scheme ultimately becomes part of the Brexit reset will depend on how willing both sides are to negotiate and to compromise. But this development is just a reminder that Brexit is not a closed chapter. The UK and the EU continue to navigate the new landscape created by Brexit, with each side trying to protect its own interests while also maintaining a cooperative relationship. And as more issues like youth mobility come to the surface, it's clear that the future of Brexit relations will be shaped by both political decisions and public sentiment on both sides. So thank you for watching Outside Views, and if you want to see another video, the next one is right here in the end screen.